everybody. I'm going to talk about addressing climate injustices within a broader context of environmental injustices. So this is the climate justice team, the CLIF team. You can see them here, you can see them in the room. Let me get straight to the key issues. On the x-axis you have time, on the y-axis you have greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, we have to get greenhouse gas emissions to zero, and that means that in 1990 it was easier to negotiate an agreement because it was still going up. And as we move towards 2030, towards 2050, this is going to become much more difficult to get any agreement at the global level, let alone at national and local level. And this explains to some extent why we are also voting in governments that do not believe in climate change. At the same time, this is the path we should be taking, but we are not taking. And that means that we are having a lot of climate impacts. So there is a rising global conflict worldwide, and with that, greater and greater demand for justice. Now, of course, technology can help, and net zero is an excuse, but we do have some other ways in which to achieve this. But the biggest problem we have from a north-south perspective is that initially the idea was that the South would follow in the footsteps of the North. And if the North could decouple its emissions from its GDP, then the South should learn from the global North. The North didn't do that, and what you're now seeing is that the rich countries, industrialized countries, have to get to zero, and the poor countries, the DCs, have to get to zero. And this basically means that we can no longer sell our lifestyles and our technologies to the global South because they need to find a different route. This makes developing countries very angry because they're hoping to emulate our lifestyles. And it makes rich countries also angry because they want to continue to sell the technologies, the old technologies, to the global South. Another problem, I don't know if you can see it, is the fact that as you postpone the highest moment from where you start to go down, in the event you want to achieve the 1.5 target, you have to go down really fast. And going down really fast is going to be full of injustices. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the injustices that have happened in the last 35 years. And I've been working on climate change for 35 years. So the first, before 1990, we knew that up to 1 degree it is green, between 1 and 2 it is orange, which means some countries will be badly affected in some regions, and beyond 2 all of us will be affected. We knew that. There was enough knowledge. And yet there has been a deliberate delay in the negotiations till 2015 before the 2-degree target was accepted. Then small island states asked for 1.5 because they did not feel protected at 2 degrees, but there was no research to support that. And only then the IPCC was asked to do 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's the politics of IPCC, and I was in IPCC for many years. That's the first point, the delay. This delay allowed rich countries to use fossil fuel for as long as they wanted. Now, if you don't know at what temperature level you are going to stabilize, then you also don't know how big your carbon budget is. If you don't know how big your carbon budget is, you do not know how to divide. And so clearly, in the last years, the carbon budget was not divided between countries or shared between countries. And in 2015, we gave up that. We said now everyone must voluntarily decide what they are going to do. And that voluntary decision has meant we are moving towards a 3-degree centigrade world. If you look at the existing research, but if you look at our research, I'm pretty sure we're going much further. And that will bring me to my third point. And this is the issue of stranded resources and stranded assets. It's not a question of just sharing the budget. Where is the oil, coal, and gas located? That's very important. Around 80% of the remaining fossil fuels is in the developing world, in their territory. There are 150 of them. They have the technology to take it out. So the big problem over here is how are we going to convince those countries not to take this resource out when we ourselves have not given an example that it is possible to do so? I think rich countries have lost their control over developing countries because now the poor countries can simply say, hey, You guys did it in the past, and we will only use our fair share. But since we never discussed with them what a fair share would look like, they can now define their fair share. And this is a big problem because Yang over there has just calculated that the amount of money that these countries will miss if they don't take out their coal is equivalent to their national GDP. So it's a lot of money. Moreover, what we see is that the global fossil fuel economy is worth between $16 trillion to $295 trillion, which is 1/5 or 3 times as much as global GDP. So the question is, who is running us? Are we really being run democratically, or are the fossil fuel companies pulling the strings? Then we come about mitigation instruments. Years ago, I wrote a book about carbon colonialism. This is 1996. And I'm very afraid that all our efforts at doing climate change efficiently, which meant writing checks to Latvia or to other countries or other projects to reduce our emissions there, have meant that we have not taken the Dutch society, the European society, the American society with us in this process and help them prepare for a phase out of fossil fuel. And then you see that the people in the Netherlands and in the United States are not happy with existing climate policy and vote in a government that is not useful. But this is really problematic. Finally, adaptation. I'm not going to discuss this in great detail, but basically adaptation costs us $15 trillion every hour if you exclude the psychological impacts and the impacts we don't know about. But essentially, it is an expensive joke, and it is really making life miserable for most people. And if you cross, we already know that at 1 degree centigrade, 70 million people will die or will be exposed to temperatures that are very high, as well as high humidity, which means they can die very quickly. This is one of the reasons in our Nature paper we published, we said 1 degree is the just target, because 1 degree will probably affect about 1% of the global population, whereas 1.5 is much more. Just to give you one simple example, at 1 degree increase in temperature means a 7% increase in water vapor, which means you get this large amount of water in the air, and it just falls overnight, a year's rainfall, as in Valencia. Why is this happening? And this brings you to the driving forces. None of us are really sitting there at the global level and discussing the driving forces, which are essentially our continuous need to have profits for our companies and our need to have GDP growth for our countries. All right, so these are the justice issues that have continuously multiplied, and this is a map made by Yang, so I'd like to share it with you. Here you are seeing all the coal mines. If it is white, the coal mine is almost coming to an end of its life. If it is dark red or orange, as you see over there in India and China, it has a long life ahead of it. This is the story of stranded resources and stranded assets, which is not being discussed at the COPs, not even this year. All right, so I think I can come up with many tragedies, but I'm going to talk about the 5 dominant tragedies and the 5 counter strategies. The first dominant strategy is that countries say, my country is so small, why should I do anything? I've heard Mr. Ritter saying this to people, we're so tiny, we can't do anything. SMEs say the same thing, and that's why it's really important to tell everybody every single emission matters. The second one is, I'm spending my money well. I'm bringing global to local. Look at Amsterdam. They're doing the donut. They're doing all kinds of interesting things in how they spend the money. But where do they earn the money? Port of Amsterdam, oil, gas. Shares in Schiphol, oil and gas. So, basically what you're finding is they earn their money in a way that is not coherent with the policy with which they spend their money. This is also true for the story about philanthropy, which my colleague Frank is working on right now. Philanthropy invests its money in ways that are completely inappropriate, also financing misinformation and disinformation on fossil fuel. Next, countries like USA and India and China, we are so big, we'll go bankrupt, that voters won't like us, blah, blah, blah. I think the story has to be we have the critical mass to change, and we can do it if we want to. All these 3 countries have enough resources, enough intelligent people. If they really wanted to change their narrative, they could. Why should I take action if others don't? That is sort of at the consumer level, but also at the business level. All the other businesses are not taking action, etc. I think for them, the story is take scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 seriously. Scope 3 is the extended life cycle of products. And then lastly, my government doesn't care, very important for you and me, as well as for the Americans. If your government doesn't care, this is the time to start talking to the city of Amsterdam to change its Port of Amsterdam storyline. It's the time to mobilize the municipalities and provinces, and history tells us that is exactly what happened when Bush became president in the United States and when Australia did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So we have a lot of implications for policy, and basically the major implication is stop investing in fossil fuel. Accelerate socially sustainable alternatives. So don't just do lithium without looking at the environmental and social impacts of the mining processes, and finance the phase out and stranded assets and resources. So let me just explain this to you. Everybody wants to finance the protein transition, renewable energy, but nobody wants to finance the non-bankable project of what do we do with the people in that sector. What do we do with the employees? How do we close down the infrastructure? If we have taken a loan and we can't pay it back, what are we going to do about that? That's the unfunded, unbankable projects that nobody wants to finance. For fossil fuel companies, I think you're on notice. You're going to go bankrupt. There's nothing else for you. And so basically, we should take a very strong attitude towards these companies. Fossil fuel using companies should go for scope 1 to scope 3. I have one little one on universities, but never mind. All right, moving to justice issues at the global level. So basically, that's the Earth Commission out there, and what we did was we are looking at planetary boundaries. Now, in the planetary boundaries, we ask a couple of questions. Is the planetary boundary just? Can we meet the minimum needs of people within these boundaries? And what is the space in between, and can we allocate this in a reasonable manner, in a just manner? How do we make sure that people who are responsible for harm are also held liable? So this is our framework, and very briefly, we have a justice narrative, which is called Earth System Justice, a little pompous, but basically the justice story is about trying to emphasize recognition and epistemic justice, interspecies justice, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. And then we have procedural and substantive. And basically, we operationalize in terms of what is the just boundary? Can we meet minimum needs within that boundary? And then how do we address the fact of those? So let me give you the results that came out last year in Nature and this year in Lancet Planetary Health, Earth Commission report. Okay, so basically, the red line is your safe boundary. And the scientists came up with what are the safe boundaries, and that's based on their scholarship. So we get different numbers. For climate change, it's 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. A safe boundary prevents irreversible harm. But is it just? And now the blue boundary is the just boundary, and this boundary tries to implement the legal principle of not causing significant harm to others. This principle used to be there, and it was just taken out of the Climate Convention and Biodiversity Convention. Anyway, so based on our ideas, we were able to calibrate that 1 degree centigrade is just, that the aerosol pollution boundary has to be tightened, as well as for nitrogen. And maybe we have to do more work on the others because we didn't have enough knowledge at the time. Where are we today? We are the yellow ball. We are outside every single boundary, except air pollution globally. But air pollution is the biggest killer globally today in urban areas and in households. So 7 million people die annually. And that is why it has been breached across the world, but not at the global level. And if you look at this map, you can see that the darker the red, the more boundaries that have been crossed at regional level. And the more white it is, the lesser the boundaries that have been crossed. So we have also worked on this at the local and regional level. That's the boundary story. Now, can we meet minimum needs within the boundaries? No, we can't because we're outside. So if you add the minimum needs, you're further outside. How did we do this? We looked at human rights. We calculated the human rights at 2 levels, dignity and escape from poverty. It's really low. We're talking about 3 bulbs and a refrigerator. We then looked at water, food, energy, and infrastructure. And then our friends from the natural sciences, they helped us do the calculation to see what does it mean for climate change impacts, for biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. That was the method. All right, this was a paper led by Ramal et al. And what you see is the blue line, 90%, it starts at 90. So 0 to 90 is outside. So the blue is the pressure on the planet if we currently, that is 2018. If you were to provide all people below the minimum, which is the goal of the SDGs, the dignified life, then that's the orange extra pressure. And if you do escape from vulnerability, then that's the pink pressure, which is about a 26% extra pressure on the environment. But you might say too many people, but in fact, the pressure of the people below the minimum is equal to the top pressure of the top 4%. One Australian in 1 hour on his ship emits more greenhouse gas emissions than an average Australian in a whole year. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of our story? On the left side, I have a column which is white, which shows you the safe and just space. Today, we are in overshoot. And if you meet minimum needs of people, you are in potential overshoot. And we have to move to the right, where we first meet the minimum needs. We have the boundaries, and then we try to live within those boundaries. So that's the just transformation. Now, this is the quantification that came out of a very long process. And basically, what you see is that the green area is the corridor you have when you have a just boundary or a safe and just boundary, and when you have given all human beings, including you and me, 3 bulbs and a refrigerator. So everyone gets the minimum, and then what is the space? This is a thought experiment. And you can see if you do this for 2050, there is no corridor left, unless we drastically change the way countries meet minimum needs, as well as we, rich people, drastically change the way we live. All right, so this is the quantitative results. So we have now quantified these boundaries. We have also got a pop-up museum in Amsterdam, which is moving around. This has the safe boundaries and just boundaries, and we're trying to communicate it to the general public, what the story is about. And we have key actions for change, and those key actions focus on changing the economic system, the changing inequality, and addressing affordable technologies. And here I'd like to say something about AI. AI uses enormous amounts of energy, water, and new minerals and metals. That's just not in the boundary. And I think we should be very careful about saying to the AI industry, you can do what you like as long as you stay within the boundary, as long as it's all based on sustainable energy and sustainable resources, which is not the current case. And that is my big fear now. All right, so there are some implications for economic approaches. And for one is that if you have a limited amount of space, then you might be called on to evaluate in economic terms, in which case it becomes too expensive and nobody can afford it. Otherwise, you have also the problem of deregulation, which the big companies have been pushing us to do, and that does not work. You have the problem of low taxes, and right now in America, you're seeing that the whole issue of going away from tax justice is very important. Market mechanisms don't work. Factors discount the future. Cost-benefit analysis does not include compensating others for the damages caused to them. And the market justice that you get from a market is just not equal to socio-environmental justice. All right, I don't know why we have a little darker version, but never mind. If you have limited resources, you have 2 options. Either you go for the rational actor model or the social practice model. In the rational actor model, there's a neoliberal capitalist model where you basically price the goods, you have markets, and you hide everything in secretive contracts and secretive arbitration. That is not going to work. The second one is hegemonic power, where upstream countries are saying we won't share our water, or other countries say America first, Netherlands second. Or you say polycentric approaches. That doesn't work either, in my view, because polycentric approaches don't help us to get back into that space. And for me, I think what we need is much more regulation, and the project that I'm developing right now is the Global Constitutionalism Project. And this project is financed by the Spinoza Premi, and we have 3 PhDs working on the law, the technology, and the governance of socio-environmental issues, building on all the earlier done work. And we are inviting everybody to submit essays for us. We have now 150 essays approximately. We are hoping to get 500 essays, and then that goes into the book of essays, as well as the ideas there are then used by the scientists to develop ideas for how a constitution should be developed, in addition to, of course, their PhD thesis. And this is the moving interactive museum piece that is also moving around, and people are putting ideas, and we have got, this has been filled up, so now it started again with a new screen. So we are getting the public involved in this process, and you're all invited. And I guess I should end on a positive note. And I think, yes, we can change. And we all have to get involved as academicians. We have to go out onto the streets. We have to tell people. We have to talk to people, not just people who agree with us, but with everybody. We really have to tell them if you use renewable energy, you can save money, you can benefit. If you manage your demand, you save money. If you can eat less meat and fish, you save your heart as well as saving money. You can buy quality over quantity. And the state has to start improving the grid. It has to remove the carbon subsidies, which are unbelievable. It's 44 billion in the Netherlands. It needs to be reduced drastically. And the state has to take responsibility, which at present in the Netherlands it is not doing, and neither is it doing that in the United States. And this bodes very badly for everybody, because the Netherlands cannot adapt on its own. It's impossible to adapt to high temperatures. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyeeta, for this really intense presentation. That's so much information, and you brought up so many really pertinent issues, and also like such impressive empirical work as well. I was really struck by all the global data that you put up in your presentation, and lots of thoughts. But let me pick on a couple of standout ideas that you mentioned in your presentation. So you talk about just boundary and
safe boundaries.
Safe boundaries and how we can achieve them. But of course, we've crossed so many of them. I just wonder, what are your thoughts about what it means for local or national policy, and if they wanted to actually achieve to meet some of your safe boundaries or just boundaries, especially given the fact that all the graphs and the data that you showed on the global situation, it's all already really dire. But as we know, environmental impacts are also unequally distributed across industrialized countries and developing countries as well. And even within developing countries, there's a lot of unequal distribution of environmental impacts. And so that's how to achieve that?
All right, so basically our safe and just boundaries are proposals. They're scientific proposals. They have not yet been taken into law, and they have to be debated in the public to see whether we got it right. That's the first step. But having said that, I know that the UN countries are not willing to talk about planetary issues or planetary boundaries, because in the Global Environment Outlook, they have said very clearly, governments, that we can talk about global environmental change, but we mustn't use the word planetary because they're afraid of the boundaries. And in the UN also, we are told not to talk about planetary, but to talk about thresholds. So there's a whole discussion about discourse. But let's talk about the national level. So if you take the biodiversity target, this is saying basically that every square kilometer of managed land, so in a city or in a farm, must have 20 to 25% green. So let's take Amsterdam. Are we having 20 to 25% green areas in Amsterdam? And if not, how do we create those green areas? Because the earthworm and the bee, they need spaces and small spaces to move in, and our flowers in our gardens need these bees and earthworms to function. So this is a target that can be done quite easily at local level. And we did a project in Lagos and in Rotterdam last year, where we were looking at, is it possible and is it not possible? What are the issues? And what you find, of course, is that when the money is available from the commenter for people, it is the rich people who apply. The poor people don't even know about it. They don't apply and they don't get the money. So the rich people get the money, and then neighborhoods become richer and richer. So there are certain things we can work on. But this is an idea. On groundwater, do not take out more water than is being recharged. So if you can enable the recharge to go up, then you can take out more water. But otherwise, you can't take it out. So this is a project that can be done very much at the local level. The surface water boundary, I think countries are going to hate, upstream countries, because it says don't let the river diminish by more than 20% per month. And that means the downstream countries get more water, but the upstream country has a real problem. And so that will contradict almost all the bilateral and multilateral agreements on water. So each of these boundaries can be downscaled. And at the downscale level, that works. Climate change is a totally different ball of game, because the temperatures are going very high. That's going high in the global south. My mom was living at 52 degrees this summer. It's terrible. Your brain stops functioning around 40 degrees, and when it hits 52, everything stops functioning. So I'm not even talking about a disaster like the rain coming and washing your house away. Just the temperature is such a horrible indicator of problems, and that's the biggest problem. So, you know, there it's a north-south issue, really.
Yeah, so let me follow up on that. Like, how do you, as a geographer, how do you deal with the unequal inequalities in the power of different stakeholder groups to negotiate, to have a say in decision-making processes, to have also access to the financing that need to actually make things happen?
Okay, so one part is I did a book in 2000 on how to negotiate, and this year I did an update. And that's called On Behalf of My Delegation. It's in French and Spanish, and it's in English, and it's free of cost. And young people download it when they go to the negotiations because they want to know what's happening. It's really complex, the process. So that's one part, trying to make sure that those who are not lawyers and, you know, that they can also feel empowered. On fighting the big guys, I don't know what we can do. Last year, we managed to get a plenary lecture at the World Economic Forum where we did speak about the 1 degree target, and they listened. Probably they ignored us. So you see in the World Economic Forum, there is a group that is interested in the environmental and social aspects, and they want input from all of us. But the big CEOs probably don't want our input, so there is a battle over there too. And so what we have to do is to find friends in unusual places. And are there people in the philanthropies, in the big businesses that really believe the same things? And can we work with them? A few months ago, I spoke to the Autoriteit Financieel Markten, and they listened to a speech like this, and then they said, yeah, but we have to obey the law, and the law says nothing really about this, so basically, we can't do what you're saying. And I'm saying, what nonsense? You can interpret the law in a different way. You can create standards. You can find room to push. So that's a debate that we and our team have to try and push them to think about more. And also, I went to the Procurement Council, which looks at Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. That is the purchase of materials to prepare a product, and then the way the product is used downstream by the user and then disposed of. And basically, they want to do Scope 1 and Scope 2, and I think, no, you have to do Scope 3. And then we said they wanted to go for net zero, and we had a whole discussion why net zero is the bad idea. And now they've written they've written zero, the pathway to zero. So they're small wins, but they are overwhelmed by the number of rich people who do not care.
So on that point about rich people who do not care, I have also a question about stranded assets, right? You made a great point about stranded assets, but then you also made a positive angle on it by saying putting fossil fuel companies on notice. And I think there is the issue of stranded assets, but beyond that, from a sociological perspective, we also see that there is stranded logics in a way, right? There's a lot of locked-in logics in financial markets, in industrial markets, about where money can be made. And as much as we say that yes, fossil fuels is on the downtrend, if you look at the financial markets, fossil fuel companies are still the most profitable companies on the market. They're still the ones that give institutional investors the highest dividends, and this creates this. This is the positive feedback from the market that makes it difficult for even institutional investors to shift away from fossil fuels.
Correct. So Clara, who's also who's also one of the PhDs, she says in her thesis that institutional investors are saying that divesting doesn't help because basically you're transferring the shares to somebody else who may not have a conscience, and engaging doesn't help with the oil companies because that's their raison d'etre. And that basically brings you back. If none of that helps, you have to go back to legislation and you have to go back to courts. Right now, there are more than 1,800 court cases, and 86 of them are against the oil companies. The state of Vermont has said to the oil companies there, you are responsible for the extreme weather events happening there, so they have to pay for those events. And I think those kinds of judgments will come very soon. So we will get a lot of punitive action coming. And even the court case in the Netherlands against Shell, which does tell them that you have to take action on your Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, even though a quantitative number was not imposed. But that is really important. It is a huge change that to tell a company, hey, we don't care what the EU is saying, you have to be responsible for your extended producer liability.
Yeah, but the latest news out of that case was that it was the Shell's appeal in the courts was successful. So, but it is a constant battle,
that's
right?
their narrative. If you look into the court cases, they're saying it's successful because a number was taken out, the reduction of emissions. But they actually lost because they were told that they're responsible for 8, 1, 2, and 3, all the scopes. So the next court case will hold them responsible. Don't worry, it will be like the tobacco industry. They will go. The problem is, will they go fast enough? And can we make them pay with retrospective effect for all the damage they've caused? Because there are court cases saying that they have done misinformation and disinformation from 1950 onwards.
So I think now is a good time to end on a positive note. Thank you very much, Joyeeta.
Thank you.